They end this third hearing with some chilling statements by former federal judge Luttig, who is well respected within the Republican Party and conservative circles, saying that Trump and his allies are a clear and present danger to democracy, not because of what happened in 2020, but because of the possibility that they will succeed in 2024, where they failed in 2020. Let's bring in our chief political analyst, John Dickerson. And that's the concern, that this isn't over.
Right. Judge Luttig, again, used to be called a mini Scalia. At the center of the conservative movement that used to be in the center of the Republican Party. There's a news center. And he's saying what's at that news center is Donald Trump and his allies. And the threat is that no one is standing up to them. And the threat is that they still continue to say the election is stolen and that they're going to school on the first attempt by Donald Trump to overturn a free election so they can do it again. In his written testimony, the judge said false claims that our elections have been stolen from us corrupt our democracy. It is an affront without precedent. That's pretty strong stuff.
And he said he doesn't issue those words lightly, or that statement, praying about it this morning with his wife before his own appearance before this committee.
Exactly. And he also said only the party that instigated this war over our democracy can bring an end to that war. That's a challenge to every sitting Republican, not just in the House and Senate, but all the way down the line to dog catcher.
Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes, who also has more on this ongoing threat that exists. Nancy?
Well, Norah, the simple fact is that there are dozens of election deniers, people who either sought to get the election results in 2020 overturned in their states or supported that effort, who are now running for governor, for state attorney general, for secretaries of state across this country. And the reason that that last position, secretary of state, is so concerning is because that's the person in most states who runs elections. That person is supposed to run those elections in an independent manner. That is something that has never been questioned. It's not easy to imagine how someone who embraced a fraudulent theory once before would be willing to do so again in 2024 in favor of their chosen candidate. And what we've already seen in this election season is that a few of these individuals have already won their Republican primaries. They are going to the general election. It happened just this week in Nevada in the primary for the Secretary of State race. It happened just last month in Pennsylvania in the race for governor. State Senator Doug Mastriano won his primary. He is someone who tried very intensely to get Biden's victory overthrown in his state. And in that state of Pennsylvania, Norah, it is the governor who appoints the Secretary of State.
And that's an excellent point. Nancy Cordes, thank you. Let's bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. And people should know Major has a new book coming out called The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. And Major, I'm still waiting for my advance copy, but I know and I've heard that it is excellent. But what you really detail is the changes in laws that make this an ongoing threat.
Well, it makes it an ongoing concern for the country, Norah, and here's why. Under the banner, and it's an umbrella term, election integrity, and honestly, who's against that? Republican legislatures have restricted voting access in some significant ways. Now, not every change in every state law is one that subverts democracy or is suppressive of voter turnout. But they create new rules enforced by Republicans who have said publicly, as Nancy indicated, that they have very partisan interpretations of these laws and will enforce them to the letter. Maybe that creates confusion. Maybe that discourages people from showing up, and it puts them in a position of power should they prevail in races for Attorney General, Secretary of State, or Governor to put their thumb on the scale should they choose to do so in the 2024 presidential election. That is the threat that Judge Luttig was referring to.
Major Garrett, thank you. And Margaret Brennan, one of the other pieces of testimony we heard today is about this confrontation between President Trump and his vice president in the Oval Office, where Trump used some choice words, calling him a wimp, other terms to suggest he didn't have the courage, the power, or the cojones, essentially, to move forward with what the president wanted him to do, and even Ivanka Trump witnessing some of it.
Yes, and to hear it in just such stark terms, it kind of lays bare that this just became about bullying that day. But if you look at the calendar, the day prior, the chief of staff for the vice president called the lead Secret Service agent and said there is going to be a security risk to the life of Mike Pence because of the fact he's taking this stand tomorrow. So the people around the vice president knew this wasn't just strong-arming someone. This was actually coming along with a direct threat potentially to the life of the vice president. And it turned out that political instinct was correct because, as we heard in the courts, that in this ongoing case, the Proud Boys had testified that there could actually be an attempt on the vice president's life. And so in that Oval Office phone call on the 6th itself, the intimidation there, the language that is used just kind of symbolizes what was really going on here. And I think, John, one of the things that's interesting to pick up on a thread from you is for Mike Pence himself, he kind of is this personification of these traditional conservative ideas of fidelity to the Constitution above all else. Faith, you heard the references to biblical verses there. That is a real question here. That is the person whose life was threatened. That is the person who took this stand. And it is a challenge in so many ways to the party, or what remains of the traditional Republican Party.
And this has always been one of the challenges with President Trump, is that his supporters and others may say, well, just what Trump says are just words.
Right.
That's all they are. But in fact, his rhetorical remarks about the vice president, about other things, in fact, were a message. And there were people that heard that message. There were people that acted on that message. January 6th is clearly a case of that. And I want to bring in Scott McFarland on this because there were right-wing extremist groups that took what he said literally. To be wild.
There's that name again, the Proud Boys. Third time in 3 hearings, this far-right group is of interest to the committee, and it's been of interest to the Justice Department as well. They're the top-line defendants charged with seditious conspiracy. But something else happened during the hearing, Norah. As we were watching the hearing at the federal courthouse down the road in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Justice Department submitted a court filing saying they would like copies of all the transcripts from the January 6th committee. They have prosecuted 840 defendants, but there are hundreds more to come. They want the paperwork from this January 6th committee. Norah, we've asked the committee about this in the past. They say the Justice Department can come and look at it, but they're not ready to hand it over yet. The DOJ is taking it to the next level. They want the papers now.
Interesting. And John Dickerson, on that point about violence and these groups, we also learned today the president knew about the violence.
Right. One of the questions here is, what did the president do when the violence started? We heard in testimony on the first night, Mike Pence got on the phone and called the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because the president wouldn't. But the president wasn't doing nothing. What he was doing was he was told, according to 2 witnesses who testified today, he was told the violence had started. And after that, he sent out a tweet that said Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. After the violence had started, he refreshed that target he put on Mike Pence's back. And that's new. And in a time when he should have been doing something else, he was refreshing his target on Mike Pence.
But that charge is stunning. That charge suggests that the president of the United States wanted something violent to happen to Mike Pence.
And it wasn't theoretical. He'd been told it was happening in the moment.
And that's why Congressman Aguilar said today, had the Proud Boys or others gotten a hold of him, they would have killed him.
Yeah, and I think also worth noting that the former vice president was underground beneath the Capitol complex for 4.5 hours, and in some cases carrying out the functions of what the president at the time should have been doing in terms of calling the military and trying to, get these folks to stand down. And so, again, the fact that he stayed, and you heard testimony about why he stayed and the importance of staying to try to do his duty, coming back, fulfilling his constitutional oath, carrying out the certification of that election until 3 o'clock in the morning, that was really his goal from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. I mean, those details about what the vice president was doing and the threat to him were remarkable that we heard today, Margaret.
They were, those images as well, but you really see as well that Pence had a sense of what the office and what the world was seeing play out in front of the cameras. I mean, all of us were watching on our own TV screens with our breaths taken away. Around the world, in capitals, we knew there were phone calls. We know from great reporting from Bob Costa and others that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was trying to field calls saying, no, we've got this. The country's not falling. But you have the vice president in there, the one who is executing those phone calls, trying to calm the actual violence that day. Meanwhile, the president is stoking it, not just in those tweets, as John talked about, but also going to the crowd that was meeting that day and again putting that target again on Mike Pence's back. At least twice we heard in testimony today. He did it in the tweet and to the crowd directly, as did John Eastman, who, by the way, the legal advisor, we now know, sent an email asking for a pardon shortly after the events concluded. So not only knew that the planning would violate the law, but had a sense he had been on the wrong side of it.
And again, these actions, as Chairman Thompson said, our democracy came dangerously close to catastrophe. And with each of these hearings, it appears just how close we came to catastrophe, which is why CBS News has been airing these hearings live every day so that people can see exactly what has happened and what we are learning. Robert Costa is on the Hill. And Robert, I know you had spoken with Judge Ludig before he went in there. This is now a challenge for the Republican Party.
For Republicans, Norah, this is a crossroads. Across the country, they feel like they are on the march ahead of this year's midterm elections. They could win power in the House, power in the Senate, perhaps win the White House again in 2024. But should they win power again at all of those levels, what kind of party will they be? And these hearings force them to look back at how Donald Trump used his presidential power to try to overturn an election. As Ludig said, what remains in American democracy is a clear and present danger to the functioning of the presidency and this system.
Robert Costa, thank you so much. Another big headline today that we learned about is that the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, Ginny Thomas, was in direct communication with John Eastman, the architect of this legal theory that the president was clinging to in order to try and cling to power. Today, we heard from Ginny Thomas, who said she's now willing to testify before the committee.
Yeah, that's right. She spoke to a conservative media outlet called the Daily Caller, saying that she is happy to clear up any misconceptions. Also worth noting that John Eastman, in the course of this hearing, has also posted online as well to his own platform, saying that this is false innuendo, some of these leaks that are coming from the committee, and saying that in the case of Ginny Thomas, that she was simply reaching out to him to speak to her group about election litigation. So he claims there was nothing more to it. But as we know, in addition to this email correspondence the committee has gotten between John Eastman and Ginny Thomas, they also have correspondence from Ginny Thomas and Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff. So that's exactly why the committee wants to learn more.
But people say, well, why does that matter, right? Why does that matter? You know, she's the wife of the Supreme Court justice. Why does that matter? Well, she's involved in politics. She's referred to her husband as her best friend, and there was an issue here involving the Supreme Court.
There was, and there were issues to come. And as there was testimony today, Eastman, this was more of a gambit than a legal theory. And the gambit relied on the courts perhaps having a favorable view or taking it up and creating enough of a delay that they could do some other razzle-dazzle play and call the election into question. And there's a text from Eastman suggesting he has some knowledge of what the court's predisposition might be on these questions. So the theory is, it is just a theory. Eastman denies it. The theory is that in this conversation with a Supreme Court justice's wife, Eastman got some indication of the position of that Supreme Court justice. And that's why it's always been interest, because the Supreme Court might have to rule on a lot of these complicated questions.
And just to further that it would get wild, right? That it would get wild up on Capitol Hill, that if Pence were to do what the president wanted to do, that at some point perhaps the Supreme Court might have to step in if there were some sort of crisis that occurred. Thanks to all of you very, very much. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight we'll have a full wrap-up on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington.